think about what is the pathway ahead? How do we get to this end goal of, what is the end goal, first of all, and how do we get there? Part of that end goal could be, staying below the red line, right? Staying below this 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius change above pre-industrial levels. But that's just one piece of this, right? That's just looking at temperature, but there's a lot of other things we have to consider in the big scheme of things when we're talking about climate change. Oops. There are lots of different pathways, and one of these alone will not get us there. We have to do multiple things in order to reach that end goal. Technology innovation, putting a price on carbon, making people that pollute pay for it, and actually enforcing those rules. Adaptation, as we're going to still see impacts no matter what we do, we have to adapt to those changes. Perhaps we need to focus on changing human behavior. And as Rebecca Henderson mentioned, our economic system, perhaps it needs to shift in a new direction where, it's not just bottom line, we're thinking about those, the true cost of things and making sure that that's part of the equation. Oops, I keep going back on my slides here. Okay. All right. So this is a graphic from the International Energy Agency and from an article that came out in 2017 that was looking at the connection between economic growth and carbon dioxide emissions, or basically fossil fuel use. And you can see that from year 2000 up through 2010, there was a tight connection between economic growth rates and fossil fuel use. And this is a big concern and a big criticism of climate policy that focuses on reduction of carbon dioxide emissions, because there's this huge fear that it's going to have a dramatic economic impact. And if one country does mitigation measures and spends a lot of money, that they're going to be put in an economic disadvantage against other countries that may not do something. But I think the trends are showing now that we're seeing a decoupling of these two different parameters. So we see here in 2016 that the global economic growth is still doing pretty well, while carbon dioxide emissions growth is going down. And in fact, in 2015, it was below 0%. So I think this is a key thing showing that economic growth does not rely on fossil fuels, and that we can see these decouple from each other, and that we can see a future without destroying the economy, if the economy is the end all be all, of course. But I think that's a really good sign. Climate policy focuses on two main areas: mitigation, basically addressing the cause of climate change, reducing the total change that we're going to see, and then adaptation. This is basically dealing with the consequences. How are we going to adapt to the changes that are already happening and the changes that are in the pipeline, so to speak? Oh, darn it. So let's start with mitigation, dealing with the causes of climate change. When we're talking about mitigation, we often talk about greenhouse gas reductions and targets around greenhouse gas reductions. And those targets are set to try and achieve, of course, that 1.5 degree or 2, depending on what you're looking at, degree temperature change above industrial levels, pre-industrial levels, by a certain date. We see this sometimes in terms of intensity-based targets, sometimes in terms of absolute based targets. Intensity is a target that's set based on some other parameter like per capita or some sort of economic factor. Absolute targets are just a total reduction in emissions target. Now, of course, these different types of targets are going to be appropriate in different situations. If you're looking internationally against different countries, intensity-based targets might make more sense rather than an absolute target, given some countries have a lot lower emissions than other countries. And the ability to make significant drops in carbon dioxide emissions is very different depending on what country you're in. Whereas absolute targets might be more appropriate in different situations. But how do we get those reductions targets? The whole point is to either avoid carbon dioxide emissions in the first place, reduce them over time, or in some cases eliminate or even remove them from the atmosphere. And we can use technological solutions, particularly in our energy supply, energy source to energy use to end, how energy demand. We can put a price on carbon in some fashion, or we can do things to affect human behavior that basically, impacts sort of the whole energy supply chain. And there's probably a lot of others out there that I haven't even thought of. So one of the first areas that I think we can make some significant change, and of course this is sort of the low-hanging fruit, right? This is the one area where you can spend a lot of money and actually make money on it. So this is one of the easier things to get buy-in for, is inefficiency. Building in efficiencies so we're not wasting as much energy. Globally, energy use is currently around 575 quads or quadrillion BTUs, which is an enormous number. It's expected to get up to maybe even as high as 770 quads by 2040. So there's a lot of concerns about how we're going to meet that energy demand. And does that mean we're going to add more energy sources to provide that energy, which could include a lot more fossil fuels? Or do we meet that demand through addressing a lot of the inefficiencies in this entire chain? There's inefficiencies in use of the energy source, and then of course the end sector use, such as industrial use, electricity generation, use in residential homes, use in transportation, and all these different areas. In fact, in the United States in 2019, according to the Energy Information Administration, 63% of the energy from these sources was wasted. You know, that's a lot of potential energy that could be utilized to meet energy demand. But again, I think there's a cautionary tale here, is that we have to make sure that if we are going to focus on efficiency, that this is not the only thing, because a focus on efficiency can actually in the long term lead to more energy use, which doesn't really solve the problem, right? It just increases the problem over time. So that's something we have to consider. So this, you can't just do this alone. Darn it, I keep doing that. Another area we can work on is, of course, the energy source portion of this. So this is U.S. primary energy consumption by energy source as of 2019 for the U.S. And if you look at the pie here, 80% of these sources are fossil fuel energy sources, and only 11% are renewable. So there's some significant gains that can be made in changing these energy sources. Now, of course, there's challenges in that, but this is an area where we can make significant gains in reducing carbon dioxide emissions. We can also use technological fixes. Perhaps we promote massive afforestation so that we can increase the flow of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere into plants. There's proposals to fertilize the ocean to increase the productivity of phytoplankton and therefore increase movement of carbon dioxide into the ocean itself. Basically using nature cycles with a little bit of help from us. There's also other types of geoengineering proposals to inject the atmosphere with stratospheric aerosol injection of particles that reflect light away. So this is sort of large scale climate manipulation. There's a lot of opponents to this type of technological future, but you know, this is one potential area that could be explored. It's very expensive, and there's definitely some pros and cons to all of these, but there are technological and natural fixes that we could work towards, basically removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or manipulating radiation. We can also put a price on carbon, right? Making those who emit carbon dioxide to the atmosphere pay for that pollution and pay the true cost. So the challenge here is what price do you put on it? Is that price high enough to actually force change? You can use fees, taxes, you can use a market-based system like a cap and trade or emissions trading program. So there's lots of different ways you can go about this. But another thing we have to consider is the impact of policies that put a price on carbon. They're a good thing, but then you have to think about the impacts on communities and people. We don't want the policy to cause undue harm to individual families. And these kinds of policies are criticized because their potential impact to increasing electricity prices on individual families. If your electricity prices go up $200 a year, that may be nothing to some communities, some families, but to others it could be very detrimental to their family budget. So this is something we have to think about, and there are ways to address this through potentially using dividend programs to try and, you know, send money back to those communities. But I'm not going to go into that any further, but lots of options on putting prices on carbon. We can also address human behavior, regulate the bad behaviors, things that cause more CO2 emissions. We don't really like regulation, especially on an individual level, so this may not be the best way to go. We can also use incentive-based strategies to incentivize desired behaviors. Incentivize purchasing fuel-efficient vehicles, incentivize electric vehicles, incentivize riding the bus, those kinds of things. Also, we need to think about providing resources to facilitate behavioral change. If that is making your home much more energy efficient, are there rebate programs that help a community or a family to actually install those types of technologies that can be expensive? And then also, I think societal pressure and modeling of behavior, maybe, and also education is on top of this, can play a large role in shifting our human behavior, and that can shift all these other areas as well. Okay, on the flip side, we have adaptation. So basically dealing with the impacts of climate change. And this is really all about managing risk, right? What are the risks? What are the specific hazards that we're going to be dealing with? How likely are communities to be exposed to those risks? And how vulnerable is that community? So adaptation is really about minimizing that vulnerability and building a capacity of communities to deal with the impacts. Knowing what they are, what they potentially could be, and whether or not a community is able to even manage that. If you're a community that is already dealing with lots of other things, and then you have this large climate impact come in, that community is going to be much more vulnerable to that. And of course, lots of other factors can influence that. So one example is sea level rise. We talked a lot about this in previous talks, but sea level is rising. It's happening now. It's going to continue to rise in the future. How much rise we're going to see, it really depends on how much mitigation measures are taken. But this could lead to loss of seashores, coastal regions, soil erosion, and lots of other things. So we can adapt to that. There might be reactive measures where you build higher, build polders and dikes and things to try and hold back the rising sea level. That's sort of a reactive approach. Or maybe a proactive or anticipatory adaptation could be, planning ahead, changing your building codes, not allowing to building in certain regions, working on adaptive capacity of your community and making sure that those who are vulnerable are going to be able to deal with those consequences of the change. And in some cases, unfortunately, this also means that some communities are going to have to evacuate and retreat from these locations. So these communities, of course, are very vulnerable because they might be crossing international borders, which can lead into climate refugees, which is, even more challenging. But one thing we have to consider is that the fixes to the problem we have to think about what their consequences are. If they're short-term fixes and they're just a band-aid, those fixes often can lead to unintended consequences, both in actually making the problem worse or having impacts to communities. So we have to make sure that the fixes don't make the problem worse and that we aren't having adverse impacts to communities that are already dealing with social inequalities. So this is a key part of this as well, that we can't forget when we're building policies. Oops. So I think to end here, I just want you to think about this question of what is our end goal? What is it we want to grow? Do we want to grow an ever-growing gross domestic product? Or is our end goal really happy, healthy, connected communities that are adaptive and care about, have empathy? What is that end goal? There's a very different pathway if we look at these from different perspectives. Not that gross domestic product isn't maybe part of this, but is that the end all be all, or is this more of the outcome that we want or the goal? So I would leave you with this, that, if we don't have a goal in mind, it doesn't really matter what path we take, right? So having a goal helps us to determine what that pathway is. All right, thank you.